Hello everyone. I'm going to go ahead and talk to you today about your value practice packet and specifically about the drawing pencils that you should have. You should have 3 of them, and then if you also happen to have a number 2 pencil, you should add that to the mix. A mechanical pencil will work just fine. It is also a number 2. So I've got my pencils here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what their characteristics are and how we use them, like for what purpose. I also am going to talk to you a little bit about how to hold the pencil properly when we're shading, make it a little bit easier for you, a little bit more efficient. And then lastly, I'm going to talk to you about blended value and what it is and how we do it. In the process of that, we'll fill out a little bit of this worksheet. I'm not probably going to do the hatching and cross hatching and stippling part of it for this particular video, but I might come back to it if you need assistance with it later on. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at your pencils. So you should have your 8B pencil and your 2B pencil. Some of you might have a 3B. And your 4H pencil. And then your number 2 pencil is actually an HB pencil. And sometimes it will say that on the pencil and sometimes it won't. Mine actually happens to do that. And then if you have a mechanical pencil instead, it is also HB. So our softest pencil and therefore our darkest pencil is our 8B. So 8Bs are really good for doing shadow areas. They can really put a lot of dark value in without putting a ton of pressure with the pencil. So it saves your hand when you're at the part where you're putting really dark areas into your drawing so that you don't have to put tons and tons of pressure on it. The downside to these is that they smudge like crazy. So I usually suggest that you end with the 8B, that you don't start with it, because if you start with it, you are guaranteed to smudge with it. It's also a little bit harder to erase because you're actually putting more graphite down onto the paper, which means that there's more to erase back up if you need to. The second pencil is kind of in a mid-range pencil, and it's the 2B. And I tend to use the 2 and 3B the most because that mid-tone range still lets me get really, really light, but then I can get pretty dark with it as well. So if I were on a deserted island and I had nothing else, you know, I could only take one pencil with me, this is the one that I would take. Your number 2 pencil is kind of right in between. And I don't know if you noticed, there is kind of a method to the madness as far as the labeling. So B relates to the softness of it, and then as the pencils get harder, it is H. So H so HB is kind of halfway hard, halfway soft. So that's our regular number 2 pencil. So it gives us, you know, and again, if this is all you have, maybe you left your drawing pencils at school, that's fine, we can work with that. And then our lightest and therefore our hardest pencil is the 4H. And this pencil is great for doing very soft contour outlines that we don't want to show up at the end of the drawing. They're good for doing highlighted areas. You have to put a lot of pressure on this to get it to show up. So that gives you a little bit of leeway if you're still kind of working on how much pressure to put to build up your value instead of just kind of going into it head over heels. The downside to this is that you do have to put pressure, so it can hurt your hand if you're trying to get darker values than it's intended for. And if you put too much pressure, it will make a groove in your paper. It is the hardest of the pencils, which means that it has the most binder and the least amount of graphite. And that's why it ends up being light. So those are your pencils. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to hold your pencil. So when you learned how to write way back in the day, you probably learned to hold it closer to the point because it gives you more control over it. And when you're doing very precise writing and you want it to be nice and crisp, that's perfect, right? You just want to be able to work with the point. And that can be great for doing contour outlining, but we're going to be doing a lot of shading. So I'm going to actually have you hold your pencil a little bit further back. And by a little it, I mean a lot. So you can see that I've already kind of shifted my hand towards the back. In this case, because the number 2 has an eraser, I'm holding it way back to the eraser. I'm otherwise, you know, not changing where my fingers are on the pencil as far as, you know, which fingers are being used to control. So the same spot, it's just I'm moving up and down the pencil. Now what this does, and I'm going to kind of zoom in so that you can see, but what this does is this lets us actually put more of the lead onto the pencil. okay, or onto the paper, sorry. So when I write, so when I write, you can see that the only part of the pencil that's touching the paper is the point. I want all of this lead here, all this nice lead, to actually show up on the paper. So by holding it towards the back, I can do that. I can actually get all of the lead on the paper, and what that means is that I can actually shade a lot faster because it's putting kind of a wider mark onto the paper. And if you're doing a small drawing, it's not that big of a deal, but when you're working on a big piece and the whole thing has different blended values, you are going to really appreciate the fact that you're using as much of the lead as you possibly can. Okay, I'm gonna kind of zoom out back here. Okay, so the other advantage to holding it this way is that it gives you a little bit more control, because one of the things I'm going to have you work on is being able to control the amount of pressure you put on the pencil. Really, once you figured out how to write as a kid, you probably you don't really think about the fact that you have to put pressure on your pencil in order to get it to write. When we're drawing and we want some areas to be light and some areas to be dark, we do need to think about that. So, and you'll see that each of the different pencils requires a different amount of pressure. So I really just kind of want you to play around with being able to create that pressure to create different values. So what I've got here is a little mini value scale, and it's not perfect, but it's getting there. I can see that there's a little bit of a transition here that needs some blending. This is what we called a blended value. So blended value is where we have a seamless transition from one shade to the next. So in other words, it doesn't look like we can find a stopping and starting point for when we're shading, that it all just kind of runs into each other. And that's our goal for this unit. I want you to be able to shade this blended value because it's going to help us create three-dimensional form, create that illusion that something is looking three-dimensional even though it's just on flat paper. So on your handout, scoot this back up. So on your handout, what I would like you to do is look at the part of the page that says blended value and drawing pencil guide, and you'll see that I've gone ahead and written the number and letter combination for each of the pencils, and I'd like you to add that to yours. So the darkest area, you're going to focus on using your 8B. You'll do your second darkest area with your 2 or your 3B. HB will be the second lightest, and then 4H is your lightest area. And what I would like you to try to do is really pay attention to making this blended value where we're not seeing the transition from the very lightest shade to the very darkest shade. Okay, and it is okay to go ahead and overlap the pencils. So where the lightest area is here, I will probably actually work with the HB and kind of pull it over a little bit into this box. And the same thing with the 8B. I may actually only go about halfway with the 8B before I start kind of transitioning to the 2B. So these are just here kind of as a general guideline. Okay, so let me know if you have questions, and I'll talk to you guys later. Hi guys, I'm back again. I thought it might be worthwhile to at least do a time lapse of me doing my own blended value. So I am going to play that here, and you can kind of watch it if you feel like you need that guidance. If you don't feel like you need that guidance, go ahead and just, do your own thing with it. So here goes. Right. And as it's playing, I'll just talk to you a little bit about some of the choices I was making here. So I started from lightest and I went to the darkest. And I actually found that I needed to lighten up my lighter values because I put them in too dark to begin with. So I did go ahead and do that. And then another thing that I did is that there were areas that I wanted to have a little bit more control over. So instead of just doing a back and forth stroke with my pencil, I did work in kind of circular movements. So be aware that there's more than one right way to do the shading. Some people like to work in small kind of controlled circles, which is honestly my preferred way, and some people like to work in kind of smaller strokes or longer strokes, so longer kind of straight lines. So that's what I've got for you. Take care, you guys. Let me know if you have any questions.